The first thing Fleet Marshal Dressa Vane felt was not fear, it was disbelief. Her sensor array had just told her that a fleet of 41 ships had appeared out of nothing at the edge of the Corvée Drift, in a system the Kelvorn Ascendancy had marked dead 300 years ago. No gate flare, no drive signature building up over hours the way every civilization she knew of required. One moment the system was empty, the next, 41 shapes hung in the dark like they had always been there, waiting to be noticed. "Run it again," she said. Her sensor officer, a thin young Kelvorn named Bertram, had already run it 3 times. He ran it a 4th. The result did not change. "Confirmed, Marshal. No drive trail, no gate resonance. They were simply..." There, Dressa stood from her chair and walked to the viewport, arms folded behind her back, the old habit of a career spent commanding fleets far larger than the one she had now. The Ascendancy had given her 6 cruisers and a mandate to investigate anomalies along the drift, a job most officers considered a slow demotion. She had taken it anyway because anomalies were the only part of the galaxy that still surprised her. This one was already the strangest thing she had seen in 40 years of service. "Bring up the hull composition," she said. The image that resolved on the main display made her breath catch. The unknown ships were massive, brutal, asymmetrical things, their armor plating scarred and pitted as if it had been dragged through centuries of cosmic dust. Long streaks of discoloration ran down every hull, the kind of weathering that came only from decades of exposure to hard radiation. Corrosion patterns spread across the metal in slow, ancient blooms. "Alloy dating," Bertram said, voice tightening. "Marshal, the composition markers suggest an age of..." "I need to check this twice." "Say the number." 11,000 years, possibly more. The bridge went quiet enough that Dressa could hear the low hum of her own ship's reactor. 11,000 years put this fleet before the Ascendancy's earliest written records, before the Kelvorn had even left their home system. Every scholar in the Archive Council would tell her the same doctrine she had been raised on since childhood. Age was proof of survival, and survival at that scale meant power beyond anything a young species could imagine. Civilizations that lasted that long did not lose wars. They did not get conquered. They simply outlasted everyone foolish enough to challenge them. "Could this be a first species relic?" Bertram asked, and there was something close to reverence in his voice. Dressa had asked herself the same question the moment the numbers appeared. The first species were half history, half religion. The ancient precursors, the Ascendancy's earliest ancestors, had supposedly glimpsed once, then never again. No confirmed contact in 10,000 years. If this fleet was truly what her instruments claimed, it would be the discovery of a lifetime. It would also, she reminded herself, likely get everyone on this bridge killed if handled wrong. "Hail them," she ordered. "Formal Ascendancy first contact protocol. Careful phrasing. I don't want to insult something that might remember insults for 10,000 years." The transmission went out. The bridge waited. Nothing came back. Not silence exactly, but a kind of patient stillness, as if the other fleet had heard the hail and simply chosen not to answer yet. Dressa found that more unsettling than an outright refusal would have been. Then, on the long-range visual feed, something changed. A single pulse of soft white light rippled down the length of the lead ship, slow and rhythmic, gone almost as soon as it appeared. It happened again a few seconds later, and again at the same interval like a heartbeat. "Marshal," Bertram said quietly, "that light pattern, it isn't a weapons charge or a communication burst. The rhythm matches nothing in our database." "It's breathing," someone murmured from the tactical station, half to himself, and nobody corrected him, because that was exactly what it looked like. Dressa's instincts, honed over decades of first contact scenarios and border skirmishes, told her 2 contradictory things at once. The scholar in her wanted to send a shuttle, to record everything, to be the officer who finally proved the first species were real. The soldier in her, the one who had buried friends after underestimating enemies that looked weaker than they were, told her that anything old enough to predate her entire civilization had not survived by being harmless. "Bring weapons to standby," she said. Not active. Just ready. Marshal, if that's a genuine first species vessel, powering weapons near it could be read as... I know what it could be read as, Bertram. I also know what happens to fleets that assume old things are automatically peaceful things. She kept her eyes on the pulsing light. We test carefully. We do not provoke, but we do not walk in blind either. The order went through. 6 Kalevorn cruisers, veterans of border conflicts and pirate hunts, quietly shifted their weapon systems from dormant to standby, capacitors beginning their slow charge. It was a small, almost undetectable change, well within the bounds of caution rather than aggression by any reasonable measure. The response was immediate. Every screen on Dressa's bridge went black at once, not flickered, not glitched, simply extinguished, all at the same instant, as though someone very far away had reached out with a single unhurried gesture and closed a hand around her ship's nervous system. The bridge lights held, the life support hummed on unaffected, but every display, every readout, every sensor feed she had been using to understand the fleet in front of her went dark in the same heartbeat. For 3 full seconds, nobody on the bridge spoke. Dressa realized she was holding her breath and made herself release it slowly, refusing to let the crew see her rattled. "Bertram," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Status." He was already working, hands flying across his console, sweat visible along his hairline even in the dim emergency lighting. "I don't understand it, Marshal. Nothing was breached. No intrusion signature, no malicious code. Nothing our defense grid even registered as a threat. It's like our own systems just agreed to stop." Agreed. That's the closest word I have. Dressa turned back to the viewport, where the 11,000-year-old fleet sat in silence, patient and unbothered, exactly as it had been before her ships had dared to power a single weapon in its presence. The soft pulse of light along the lead vessel's hull continued at the same unhurried rhythm, utterly indifferent to what it had just done. She had spent her entire career believing that age was the surest measure of danger in the galaxy. Standing on a bridge gone dark by nothing more than a passing thought from something ancient, she understood for the first time that she might have been asking the wrong question all along. The screens flickered back to life a moment later, systems restoring themselves as if nothing had happened. On the display, a single new line of data appeared where the sensor logs had been wiped clean. It was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was a designation, pulled from some registry the Ascendancy had never encountered before, tagging the unknown fleet with a single word that meant nothing to Dressa and everything to the silence that followed it. Amaranth. 300 kilometers away, inside a ship the Kalevorn had just labeled an 11,000-year-old relic, someone was arguing about coffee. "It's not that the machine is broken," said Petty Officer Marcus Diallo, holding the offending cup like it had personally betrayed him. "It's that it's broken again. That's the 4th time this month." "Then stop hitting it," said Captain Elena Reyes without looking up from her tactical display. "Percussive maintenance is a valid engineering technique, Captain. Not on a machine that makes the only good coffee left on this ship, it isn't." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the bridge crew, the kind of laughter that came easily to people who had shared a small space and a hard war for a very long time. Reyes let herself smile for exactly as long as she could afford to, then let it go, because the console in front of her had just lit up with something that mattered more than coffee. "Captain," said her sensor officer, Lieutenant Priya Osei, "we've got a contact. 6 ships, unknown configuration, powering weapons to stand by about 400 clicks off our starboard flank." Reyes stood, and the easy warmth of a moment ago folded itself away into something sharper. "Configuration?" "Nothing in our archive. Compact hull design, heavy plating, no visible scarring." Osei paused. "Captain, their ships look clean, new, like they rolled off a shipyard last week." That got a few raised eyebrows around the bridge. On the Amaranth and on every ship in the small fleet Reyes commanded, clean was not a word anyone used to describe a hull anymore. Every vessel she had brought out here carried the scars of a war that had ended only a handful of years ago, a war that had cost humanity more than most of her crew liked to talk about. Patch plating welded over patch plating. Scavenged armor bolted on wherever the original design had failed. Reactor housings reinforced with whatever scrap had been on hand when the shipyards themselves were burning. To an outside eye, the Amaranth and her sister ships did not look like the pride of a spacefaring civilization. They looked like survivors, because that was exactly what they were. Options, Reyes said. They're not hailing, Osei reported, but their weapon status just changed. Stand by to charging. Copy that. Reyes kept her voice level, the same tone she used whether the news was good or catastrophic, because a jumpy captain made for a jumpy crew, and a jumpy crew got people killed. Diallo, hold position, do not power weapons. Ooh. I want them to see us sit still. Sitting still in front of an unknown fleet charging weapons, Diallo said, already moving to comply. Bold strategy, Captain. It's not boldness. It's math. If they wanted us dead, they'd have opened fire from 400 clicks instead of powering up in plain sight. She studied the unknown ships on her display, 6 vessels arranged in a defensive formation that looked disciplined, cautious, almost textbook. Whoever was out there, they were not reckless. That was, in its own way, reassuring. They're testing us. Let's not fail the test by looking scared. A hail came through a moment later, translated by the Amaranth's systems into something close to formal, old-fashioned standard, full of careful diplomatic phrasing that sounded like it had been written by a committee worried about causing offense. Reyes almost laughed. Almost. Put me through, she said, and dropped into her chair, elbow on the armrest, chin resting against her knuckles, the posture of someone far more relaxed than the moment probably called for. This is Captain Elena Reyes, Earth Fleet Vessel Amaranth. You've got our attention. What can we do for you? There was a pause on the other end, longer than diplomatic protocol usually allowed. When the response came back, it carried a stiffness that suggested whoever was speaking had expected something else entirely. Something older, grander, more ceremonial. This is Fleet Marshal Dressa Vane of the Kaelvorn Ascendancy, the voice said. You are addressing us from a vessel our instruments date at approximately 11,000 years of continuous operation. We request clarification. Reyes glanced sideways at Osei, who was doing an admirable job of not visibly reacting. Diallo was not doing nearly as well. He'd gone very still at his station, jaw working like he was chewing on a laugh he knew better than to let out. 11,000 years, Reyes repeated slowly. Correct. Marshal Vane, I appreciate the compliment, but this ship is 9 years old. Built in a shipyard that doesn't exist anymore, by people who were mostly in a hurry and mostly out of good materials. She kept her tone easy, almost amused, though something in her chest had gone tight at the mention of that shipyard. If she looks ancient to you, that's because we've had a rough few years, not because we're old. Another pause, longer this time. Reyes could picture the confusion on the other end perfectly, though she couldn't see a single face. Your alloy composition and radiation weathering are consistent with millennia of deep space exposure, Vane said. This is not a claim we make lightly. I believe you. I also believe our sensors and yours are reading 2 very different stories off the same hull. Reyes let the silence sit for a beat before adding gently, We've fought a war, Marshal. A bad one. It ages a ship faster than time does. She heard nothing back for several seconds, and in that gap, she found herself thinking about the people who weren't on this bridge anymore, the ones whose names were etched into a wall 2 decks down. War aged more than ships. She pushed the thought aside before it could take root, because there wasn't room for it right now. We would request a formal meeting, Vane said finally, to resolve this discrepancy. Granted, Reyes said. Send your terms. We'll work something out. The channel closed. For a moment, the bridge sat in a silence that was almost companionable, everyone processing what had just happened at their own pace. Well, Diallo said at last, unable to hold it in any longer. That's the first time anyone's called this rust bucket a treasure of ancient history. Log it, Reyes said, allowing herself the smallest flicker of a smile. Might be the nicest thing anyone said about the Amaranth since the day she launched. But under the humor, A colder thought was already forming, one she didn't share with the bridge. Whoever these Kael'vorn were, they measured strength in centuries. If a 9-year-old warship covered in battle scars could fool their sensors into reading 11,000 years of history, then either their science had a serious blind spot, or humanity's wounds ran deeper than even her own instruments could measure. She ordered a standard diagnostic scan run across the Amaranth's core systems, more out of habit than concern. 20 minutes later, Osi called her back to the bridge, her voice carrying an edge Reyes hadn't heard from her before. "Captain, you need to see this. A probe just attached itself to our outer hull near the primary conduit access. Small, automated, non-hostile signature. It made contact with our systems for less than 4 seconds before disengaging and pulling away. Damage? None that we can find, but Captain..." Osei turned the display toward her. The probe's own onboard memory came back completely blank. Every log wiped except one final image, time-stamped the moment before it disconnected. Reyes leaned in. The image showed the interior access corridor near the conduit, lit in the Amaranth's familiar dim work lighting. Standing directly in frame, close enough to have clearly seen the probe, was one of her own engineers, grinning, utterly unbothered, one hand raised in an easy, deliberate wave. The problem was that when Reyes checked the duty roster, no engineer had been anywhere near that section of the ship at that time. Nobody had. Archivist Prime Solon. Kay had spent 30 years proving that mysteries were only the failures of people too lazy to keep looking, and he intended to prove it again before the week was out. He arrived aboard Dressa Vane's flagship without ceremony, a lean, sharp-eyed Kael'vorn scholar whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. Where Dressa commanded with instinct sharpened by decades of combat, Solon ruled through precision, data, citations, the slow accumulation of proof that eventually made an argument impossible to deny. He had read the reports from the encounter twice before boarding the shuttle, and both times he had reached the same conclusion. "This is not a first-species vessel," he said, before Dressa had even finished her greeting. "It's a fraud, or a misreading, or both. I intend to find out which." Dressa allowed herself a thin, tired smile. "You'll forgive me if I don't share your certainty, Archivist. I stood on my own bridge and watched every screen go dark the instant we so much as readied our weapons near them. A defensive countermeasure. Impressive engineering, certainly. It proves nothing about the age of the vessel that deployed it." Solon fell into step beside her as they walked the corridor toward the command deck. "Ancient does not mean sophisticated, Marshal, and sophisticated does not mean ancient. You of all people should know the difference. And what do you make of a probe returning with its memory wiped clean, save for a single image of a crewman who, according to the human's own logs, was nowhere near that part of the ship?" That, at least, gave Solon pause, a small crack in his certainty quickly papered over. "Sensor artifact, corrupted playback. There are a dozen mundane explanations before we reach for the miraculous." He didn't sound entirely convinced by his own words, but he said them anyway, the way a man repeats something he needs to be true. They requested a formal meeting through official channels, expecting the usual delays and posturing that accompanied first contact between wary powers. Instead, Captain Reyes responded within the hour, brisk and almost casual, inviting them aboard the Amaranth directly, rather than proposing neutral ground. Solon took it as a sign of arrogance. Dressa suspected it was something closer to confidence, the kind that didn't need to hide behind procedure. The shuttle ride over gave Solon time to review the alloy data one final time, running the numbers himself rather than trusting his instruments. Every result came back the same. 11,000 years, give or take a margin of error too small to explain away. He hated it. Numbers that refused to cooperate with a working theory were, in his experience, either broken instruments or the seeds of every great discovery of his career. He was determined to prove it was the former. Stepping aboard the Amaranth through her main airlock, both Kael'vorn officers went quiet for a moment neither would later admit to. The interior did not look like the sanctified chamber of an ancient relic. It looked lived in. Scuff marks worn into the deck plating from years of boots passing the same routes. A hand-painted mural on one bulkhead, crude but clearly cared for, depicting a blue and green world beneath a stretch of stars. Handwritten names etched into a stretch of wall near the corridor junction. Dozens of them, arranged with obvious care. Flowers made of scavenged wire propped beneath a few. Solon didn't need a translation to recognize a memorial when he saw one. "This way," said the young officer escorting them, Petty Officer Diallo, walking with the loose, easy gait of someone entirely unbothered by two representatives of a much larger empire trailing behind him. "Captain's expecting you." Reyes met them in a small briefing room that looked more like it belonged on a working cargo vessel than a ship of war. A scarred table, mismatched chairs, a large window showing open space rather than any grand display of technological might. She stood as they entered, offering the kind of handshake Solon found disarmingly informal for a first contact between species. "Marshal, archivist." Reyes gestured them toward seats. "I'll be straight with you both since I get the sense that's not always standard out here. My ship isn't ancient, my crew isn't a myth, and whatever your instruments are telling you, the truth is a lot less exciting and a lot more complicated." "Then explain it," Solon said, cutting straight to the point, ignoring Dressa's brief glance of warning. "Explain how alloy composition consistent with 11,000 years of continuous radiation exposure exists on a hull you claim is less than a decade old." Reyes considered him for a long moment, weighing something Solon couldn't read. "We fought a war," she said finally. "Not the kind with clean lines and formal declarations. The kind where you lose entire colonies in a single week, and the only thing that keeps your species alive is throwing away every rule about how technology is supposed to develop and building whatever works, however fast you can build it. We didn't have decades to refine our alloys through careful research. We had months, sometimes days, and materials salvaged from wrecks and colonies that weren't coming back. What your instruments are reading as age isn't age. It's damage, stress, radiation exposure concentrated into a handful of terrible years instead of spread across millennia." Solon opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, running the numbers through his head. It was an elegant explanation, disturbingly elegant, the kind that fit the data almost too well. If true, it meant the Kael'vorn's entire method of judging a civilization's strength by the age of its technology was measuring the wrong thing entirely. "We're not old," Reyes said quietly into the silence he'd left behind. "We're just tired." Dressa studied her carefully, noting the way the human captain's easy confidence had for just a moment slipped into something rawer. "Tired enough to wipe the memory of a probe and leave behind the image of a man your own logs say wasn't there?" Something flickered across Reyes's face. Not surprise, Solon noted, but caution. She knew something about that image. She simply wasn't going to share it yet. "I can't explain everything today," Reyes said. "Some of it I don't fully understand myself. What I can tell you is this. We're not your enemy, we're not gods, and we're not relics. We're survivors trying to figure out where we fit in a galaxy that apparently already had opinions about us before we ever introduced ourselves." The meeting ended without the clean resolution either Kael'vorn officer had hoped for. As their shuttle disengaged from the Amaranth and began its return arc, Solon sat in silence, turning the conversation over in his mind, searching for the flaw in Reyes's explanation and failing to find one that satisfied him. Dressa, watching the human ship recede on the shuttle's rear display, noticed something her sensors flagged almost as an afterthought. A brief, sharp spike in the Amaranth's reactor output, gone as quickly as it appeared. She pulled the readout and stared at it, then stared longer, because the energy signature it recorded, for the fraction of a second it existed, matched no known power curve in the Ascendancy's entire scientific archive. Not ancient, not primitive. Something else, something that by every law of physics the Kael'vorn understood, should not have been achievable by any species, let alone one that claimed to be less than a decade removed from total war. "Solon," she said slowly, turning the display toward him. "Look at this." He looked. His carefully constructed certainty, the one he'd carried since before they'd ever boarded that ship, cracked a little further. "That's not possible," he said. "No," Dressa agreed, watching the spike vanish from her readout as suddenly as it had appeared, as if someone aboard the Amaranth had noticed it being recorded and shut it down on purpose. "It isn't. And yet there it is." Neither of them said what they were both thinking. That whatever Elena Reyes and her crew truly were, they had just shown the Kael'Vorn ascendancy something it was not supposed to see, and then hidden it again before anyone could ask why. Linguist Eurythes had never planned on breaking the law of an empire she'd served loyally for 18 years, but the more she listened to the human archives, the harder it became to look away. She was not a soldier, not a scholar of Solin's rank, just a translator assigned to the joint liaison team, formed in the uneasy weeks after the Amaranth encounter. Her job was simple on paper: assist in decoding human linguistic patterns to smooth communication between the two fleets. In practice, it meant hours spent alone with recordings, logs, and fragments of human history the ascendancy had been quietly gathering, searching for anything that might explain the contradictions nobody above her pay grade seemed able to resolve. It was in one of those late solitary shifts that she found Elena Reyes's private log. She wasn't supposed to have access to it. The file had been mislabeled during a data transfer, buried among a batch of harmless technical manuals. And Yira told herself afterward that she'd only meant to check it for translation errors. That excuse lasted about 4 minutes, right up until the moment she realized what she was actually listening to. Day 112 since the fall of Meridian Colony, Reyes's recorded voice said, quieter and rawer than the version Yira had heard address Fleet Marshal Vane. We lost the Callaway and both her escorts trying to hold the evacuation corridor. 206 souls. I keep telling myself the number will start meaning something different eventually. It hasn't yet. Yira sat very still, headset clutched in both hands, and kept listening. Over the following nights, piecing together fragments out of order, she assembled a picture the official human briefings had never fully shared. A war that hadn't been fought against another empire's fleet, but against something the humans called the Hollow, an enemy that struck without warning, erased entire colonies in single brutal engagements, and left no diplomats behind to negotiate with. Humanity had faced it essentially alone, cut off from the rest of the galaxy, with no ancient allies and no centuries of stockpiled knowledge to draw on, just people, and the terrible math of trying to survive extinction on a timeline measured in months. What struck Yira most wasn't the scale of the loss, staggering as it was. It was the pace of everything that came after. Weapons platforms redesigned and deployed within weeks instead of decades. Reactor technology re-engineered under fire. Refined not through careful peacetime research, but through the brutal, immediate feedback of watching what worked, keep people alive, and what didn't get everyone killed. Humanity hadn't spent 11,000 years developing its technology. It had spent perhaps 11,000 days, compressed into a handful of years, forged in conditions no stable civilization would ever willingly choose. That was the scarring the Kael'Vorn instruments had been reading. Not age. Trauma, layered so densely it mimicked the signature of a thing far older than it truly was. Yira sat back from her console, the weight of the realization settling over her slowly. It answered one mystery, and immediately opened a darker one. If human technology looked ancient because of what they'd survived, what did that say about the kind of threat capable of forcing that survival in the first place? And why, she wondered, had Reyes been so careful to hide the reactor spike from Dress's sensors during their meeting? If humanity truly had nothing left to conceal, she might have let the second question sit, unanswered and uncomfortable, if she hadn't stumbled across the file that changed everything 2 nights later. It was buried deep in the Ascendancy's own restricted historical archive, filed under a classification so old, the modern retrieval systems barely recognized the format. Yira found it only because she'd gone looking for any precedent, any past encounter the Kael'Vorn might have had with a species whose technology defied their aging models the way humanity's did. What she found instead was a record from nearly 9,000 years ago, long before the current Ascendancy government, back when the Kael'Vorn had still been expanding aggressively into unclaimed space. A full fleet, 11 cruisers strong, had been dispatched to investigate an anomaly near what the record called the Ashfall Expanse. The report ended abruptly. A single line, appended much later by an unnamed archivist, noted that no wreckage, no survivors, and no further contact had ever been recovered. The species responsible was never identified. The incident was quietly reclassified, buried, and effectively erased from every history taught to Kael'Vorn schoolchildren since. Attached to the file, badly degraded but still partially legible, was a final transmission fragment from the fleet's flagship, recorded in the last minutes before contact was lost. Yira ran it through every restoration filter she had access to, and managed to recover perhaps a third of it. It was enough. Not weapons, not a fleet. Something underneath everything, waiting. They didn't fight back until we forced them to. And then the recording ended there, static swallowing whatever came next. Yira stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the particular kind of cold that came from realizing a story she'd been taught her entire life was, at best, incomplete and at worst, a carefully constructed lie. The ascendancy's foundational doctrine, that age equaled strength, that ancient things were to be revered or avoided but never provoked, hadn't come from nowhere. Someone, thousands of years ago, had learned that lesson the hard way, and then made sure nobody remembered exactly how. She thought about Reyes, standing calm and unshaken on the Amaranth's bridge, hiding a power spike that shouldn't have been possible. She thought about the human memorial wall, dozens of names etched with obvious grief and obvious care. She thought about a species that had rebuilt itself from near annihilation in less time than most civilizations, spent debating minor trade policy, and had done it without ever once claiming to be anything more than tired. What are you people, really? She thought, and found she wasn't sure anymore whether the question frightened her or moved her closer to something like awe. She should have reported the file immediately. Regulation demanded it, and every year of loyal service told her to walk it straight to the Archive Council and let people with more authority decide what to do with it. Instead, she sat alone in the dim light of her console, copied the fragment onto a private drive, and told herself she needed more time to understand what she was actually looking at before she handed it over to people like Solon K, who would file it, categorize it, and quietly bury it exactly the way someone had buried it the first time. Her console chimed softly behind her. An incoming priority message from Fleet Marshal Vane's staff, requesting her presence at a briefing scheduled for the following morning. Routine, on its surface. Yira's hand hovered over the acceptance key for a long moment before she pressed it, a small, cold certainty settling into her chest that whatever she thought she'd discovered tonight, it was about to become considerably more complicated. She was right, though not in any way she could have predicted. Less than 6 hours later, before the briefing could even begin, a distress signal tore through the Joint Fleet's communications array, flagged with the kind of priority code that hadn't been used in years. The signature of a real attack, not a drill, not a misunderstanding, closing fast on both the Kelvorn and human ships still gathered at the edge of the Corvai drift, and whoever was behind it had timed the assault for the exact moment both fleets were least prepared to face it together. The alarms hit the Amaranth's bridge less than a second before the first missile salvo lit up her sensors, and Elena Reyes was out of her chair before the second alert finished sounding. "Talk to me," she said, already moving toward tactical. Unknown hostiles, 40-plus contacts, dropping out of cover along the drift's outer debris field. Osei's hands were steady even as her voice climbed half a register. "They came in quiet, Captain. No drive flare until they were already inside engagement range. This wasn't luck. Someone timed this." Reyes didn't need the confirmation to know it. Nobody stumbled into a perfect ambush against two separate fleets gathered at the same coordinates by accident. Someone had been watching the Kelvorn and human ship since the first contact, waiting for exactly this moment. Both sides still uncertain of each other, still feeling out the edges of a fragile, untested arrangement, neither one fully prepared to fight alongside the other. "Get me the Kelvorn command channel," she said. Dressa Vane's voice came through a heartbeat later, clipped and controlled despite the chaos already unfolding on her own displays. "Captain, I assume you're seeing what we're seeing. 40-plus unknowns, hard vector toward both our fleets. I don't think this is a territorial dispute, Marshal. I think somebody wanted us both here, distracted and vulnerable at the same time." A pause, brief and heavy with the same conclusion Reyes had already reached. "Agreed. Recommend a joint defensive formation. Your fleet's tactics are unconventional. We may need that." "Copy. Sending vectors now." Reyes didn't have time to feel the weight of that admission. a Kael'vorn fleet marshal, raised on doctrine that measured worth in centuries, asking for help from a fleet she'd first mistaken for ancient wreckage. She filed it away for later, because the enemy formation on her display had just split into 3 attack vectors, and 2 of them were driving straight for the Kael'vorn's more lightly escorted support ships. Diallo, get us between the Marshal's transports and that second vector. Osei, feed targeting data to every ship in the fleet, human and Kael'vorn both, if their systems can even read our format. Working on it, Captain. It's going to be ugly. It's already ugly. Make it useful. What followed was not the clean, disciplined engagement Kael'vorn doctrine trained its officers to expect. Human tactics, born out of years fighting an enemy that gave no warning and followed no recognizable rules, were fast, improvisational, almost reckless by comparison. Ships breaking formation on a moment's notice, weapons fire concentrated in bursts calculated less by textbook efficiency, and more by hard-won instinct about where an enemy would be a half-second from now, rather than where it currently sat. Dressa watched it unfold across her tactical display, with a mixture of alarm and something close to awe. Her own disciplined formations bending and adapting to match a rhythm she'd never trained for, and somehow found herself keeping pace with anyway. They're not fighting like a fleet, Solon said beside her, gripping the edge of his console as the ship rocked under a near miss. They're fighting like each ship is making its own decisions in real time. They are, Dressa said, watching Reyes's small, battered fleet weave through the enemy formation with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible for ships that size. That's exactly what they're doing. The battle turned uglier before it turned favorable. A concentrated enemy strike broke through the Kael'vorn's outer screen, driving hard toward a transport carrying nearly 200 crew, its escort already crippled and drifting. Dressa's own reserves were too far out of position to reach it in time. She watched the numbers on her display and understood, with the particular clarity that came only in the worst moments of command, that she was about to lose that ship and everyone aboard it. Then the Amaranth moved. Reyes didn't hesitate, didn't request permission, didn't wait for the numbers to favor her. She put her own flagship directly into the enemy's firing line, absorbing a strike meant for the crippled Kael'vorn transport, her ship's aging, battle-scarred armor buckling under the impact in a way that made Dressa's chest go tight with something she didn't have time to name. "Captain," Osei's voice cracked through the comm. "Hull breach. Decks 9 through 11. We are venting atmosphere. Hold the line," Reyes said, voice steady even as alarms screamed behind her. "Get that transport clear. That's the whole job right now." The transport broke away, damaged but alive, its 200 crew intact. The Amaranth held her position a moment longer than she should have, taking a second glancing strike before finally pulling back, trailing debris and atmosphere into the dark, but still moving under her own power. On the bridge, Reyes gripped the edge of her console hard enough to whiten her knuckles, jaw tight, saying nothing about the cost of the decision she'd just made. Because there wasn't time, and there wasn't a version of that conversation that would help anyone right now. Dressa, watching it happen in real time, felt the last of her old doctrine crack open completely. This was not a species playing at ancient wisdom, hoarding power behind the mask of a ruin. This was something that threw itself without hesitation between danger and strangers it had known for less than a week, because the math of the moment demanded it, and no one aboard that ship had waited to be asked. The tide of the battle turned soon after, human and Kael'vorn ships finally finding a shared rhythm. Neither side had trained for, but both adapted to out of sheer necessity, until the remaining enemy vessels broke formation and began a fighting retreat toward the drift's outer debris field. Dressa ordered a controlled pursuit, unwilling to let the attackers vanish back into whatever cover had hidden their approach in the first place, but the enemy commander's ship, badly damaged and clearly beyond saving, made no attempt to flee. Instead, on every open channel across both fleets, a final transmission crackled to life, distorted and failing, addressed to no one and everyone at once. "You think you understand what you found," the voice said, alien and strained, each word costing something visible in the way it dragged and broke. "You brought a god to your doorstep and you called it old." A pause, filled with static and something that might have been a dying laugh. "Ask them why they never age." The channel cut to silence a heartbeat later, followed almost immediately by the flare of the enemy flagship's reactor going critical, a bright, final bloom of light against the dark that Dressa watched without truly seeing, the words already burning through every assumption she had left. She turned toward the display, still tracking the Amaranth, damaged, venting, but alive, and thought about the reactor spike she'd caught and lost days earlier, about Reyes's careful, unfinished answers, about a fleet that looked 11,000 years old and fought like it had never once stopped to catch its breath. "Solon," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off the human ship. "Get me everything the archive still has buried about the Ashfall Expanse. All of it. I don't care what classification is on the file." Solon turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he didn't argue. On the Amaranth's bridge, in the smoke and the flickering emergency lighting, Elena Reyes stood very still, staring at the last echo of that transmission on her own display, and said nothing at all, because she, more than anyone else in either fleet, understood exactly what question had just been asked, and exactly how much longer she could avoid answering it. The request for a formal briefing came through less than a day after the battle, and this time, Elena Reyes did not try to keep the conversation casual. She met Dressa, Solon, and a visibly nervous Eurythes in the same worn briefing room aboard the Amaranth, the memorial wall visible through the open corridor behind her, 3 new names added to it since the engagement at the Drift. Nobody commented on them, though Reyes noticed Dressa's eyes linger there for a moment before she took her seat. "You have questions," Reyes said. "I think it's time I actually answer them." Yura went first, sliding a data pad across the table with hands that weren't quite steady. "I found this in a restricted ascendancy archive, 9,000 years old. A fleet sent to investigate an anomaly near the Ashfall Expanse. It never came back." She hesitated. "The last transmission mentioned something waiting beneath everything, something that didn't fight back until they forced it to. I think it might be connected to you, to what you are." Reyes studied the fragment for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, but recognition, heavy and old. "It's not a first species," Reyes said quietly. "There isn't one. Not the way your history remembers it. What your fleet found 9,000 years ago wasn't ancient at all. It was early. Some of the first human colony ships ever launched, sent out generations before anyone back home had any real understanding of what waited past our own solar system. They went dark. We assumed they'd simply been lost to distance and silence." She set the pad down. "We didn't know until just now that anyone had ever found them, or what happened when they did." Solon leaned forward, his usual sharp skepticism giving way to something closer to disbelief. "You're saying the wreckage that shaped our species' entire understanding of ancient power, the doctrine that built the Ascendancy's foreign policy for 9,000 years, was human?" "I'm saying it's possible," Reyes said. "And if it's true, then the thing your ancestors provoked wasn't a god. It was a handful of frightened, isolated colonists with early technology and no idea what they were dealing with, defending themselves the only way they could. Whatever they did, however it looked from the outside, it wasn't power, it was desperation." She let that settle before continuing. "We've been that a lot longer than any of us would like to admit." The room was quiet for a long moment. Dressa was the one who finally spoke, her voice lower than usual, stripped of the formal weight she usually carried. "The reactor spike," she said, "during our first meeting aboard this ship. You hit it before I could get a full reading. Why? Didn't know yet if you'd see it as a discovery or a threat? Because every time humanity has shown someone something we couldn't fully explain, we've had to fight to prove we weren't a danger that needed to be put down first and understood later." She met Dressa's eyes directly. "You want to know why your instruments rate our ships as 11,000 years old? It's not one answer. It's 3, stacked on top of each other, and none of them are comfortable." She counted them off, quiet and precise. "First, the war. We compressed decades of normal research into months, sometimes days, because the alternative was extinction. That leaves scars your instruments read as age because trauma and time can look almost identical from the outside if you don't know what you're measuring. Second, Some of our earliest colony expeditions really did vanish into deep space long before your ascendancy ever existed, and some of what your people found out there over the centuries, quietly filed away as first species relics, was probably us. Fragments of a diaspora nobody back home ever knew had survived, let alone left a mark on a civilization that hadn't been born yet. And third, she said, voice dropping further, quieter now, almost private. Some of what your sensors picked up off this ship isn't technology at all, not in the way you mean it. It's something we built out of necessity during the war, something we still don't fully understand ourselves that lets a handful of trained specialists interface directly with a ship's systems in ways that don't leave a normal signature behind. That's your probe. That's your engineer who wasn't on the duty roster. It isn't a ghost and it isn't a myth. It's a person doing a job we don't talk about, because the last time anyone outside humanity got a good look at it thousands of years ago, it ended in a graveyard of Kaelvorn ships and a legend about a god you spent 9,000 years being afraid of. Solon sat back slowly, the last of his careful evidence-built certainty finally giving way, not to confusion, but to something like clarity. Our entire doctrine, he said, half to himself. Age as strength, old as untouchable. We built 9,000 years of foreign policy on a misunderstanding of a handful of terrified people trying to survive first contact with the unknown. You wouldn't be the first civilization to build a religion out of a misunderstanding, Reyes said, not unkindly. You won't be the last either, but you're the first one who's actually sat down and asked us the right questions instead of just writing another myth and moving on. Dressa was quiet for a long moment, turning something over in her mind that Reyes suspected went far beyond this conversation, far beyond this ship. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the rigid formality she'd walked in with. I built my entire career on believing that survival at scale was the only true measure of strength, she said. That anything old enough to have lasted had earned the right to be feared or revered, and everything else was simply waiting its turn to prove itself. I have spent 40 years operating under that belief. She looked at Reyes directly. You're not old, Captain. You're barely a heartbeat in the timeline my people measure ourselves against. And you have shown me more genuine strength in the last 2 weeks than I have witnessed in 4 decades of service. That's not strength, Reyes said quietly. That's just what's left after you refuse to let something break you completely. We didn't survive the Hollow because we were powerful. We survived because we decided, over and over again in the worst moments any of us had ever lived through, that we weren't finished yet. She glanced toward the wall of names visible through the open corridor. The scars aren't proof of how strong we are. They're proof of how much we lost getting here. I'd trade every bit of that 11,000-year reading your instruments gave us for about 100 people who aren't on that wall anymore. Nobody had an answer for that, and nobody tried to offer one. Some silences didn't need filling. It was Dressa who broke it, eventually, standing and offering something that was not quite a formal gesture, and not quite a simple one either. The ascendancy will need time to fully process what today has meant, Captain. Old doctrines do not unmake themselves overnight, and I suspect the Archive Council will resist this for longer than either of us would like. She paused. But I intend to stand before them myself and say plainly that the age of a civilization's wounds is not the same as the age of its wisdom, and that the Kaelvorn ascendancy owes humanity an alliance built on respect, not myth. I will stake my rank on that argument if I must. That's a considerable risk for a species you met 2 weeks ago, Reyes said. It's a considerable risk for a species that put its own flagship between my crippled transport and certain destruction without waiting to be asked, Dressa said simply. I've built my career on caution. I find I'm no longer interested in being cautious about this. The meeting ended not with a formal treaty, not yet, but with something quieter and, in its own way, more binding. An understanding between 2 people who had each, in the space of a single brutal encounter, been forced to rebuild the foundation of everything they thought they knew. Later, once the Kaelvorn shuttle had departed and the Amaranth's corridors had settled back into their familiar hum, Reyes made her way down to the memorial wall alone. She stood in front of it for a long while, the way she did most nights when the ship was quiet enough to allow it, reading names she already knew by heart. She thought about the 11,000 years her ship had never actually lived, and the handful of terrible years it had, and how strange it was that both could leave the exact same scars if you didn't know what you were looking at. She thought about Dressa, standing in a room full of ancient doctrine and choosing for the first time in 40 years to bet everything on something new instead. Reyes reached out and, with careful hands, added one more name to the edge of the wall. Not a member of her own crew, but an honorary addition all the same. A small gesture that would mean nothing to most of the galaxy, and everything to the two people who understood exactly why it belonged there. Then she looked out through the viewport at the stars beyond, at a galaxy that had spent 9,000 years believing humanity was either myth or monster, and finally, for the first time since the war had ended, let herself believe that maybe, at last, they were about to be understood as something far simpler and far harder to earn. Not ancient, not gods, just unbroken, and still standing, and no longer alone.